Before the world sang along to country roads, there was a boy who never stayed long enough to feel safe anywhere. He kept leaving, not because he wanted to, but because life never asked him to stay. Every move carved something out of him, quietly, repeatedly, until loneliness became familiar and home became an idea instead of a place. This is not just the story of a singer who made people feel warm inside. It's the story of a man who spent his entire life running towards something he could never quite touch. Was he chasing peace, or escaping something deeper he never learned how to face? If you believe music can heal, if you believe stories can expose what fame hides, take 1 second, like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because what you think you know about John Denver is only the surface, and the truth begins long before the songs. John Denver entered the world as Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., born into a military family where stability was never promised and permanence never guaranteed. His earliest memories were shaped not by a hometown, but by movement, by packed boxes, and by the quiet understanding that nothing around him was meant to last. From the beginning, life taught him that attachment came with an expiration date. His father was an Air Force officer and flight instructor, a man defined by discipline, precision, and duty, whose connection to the sky felt stronger than his connection to the ground. Orders came down, routes were changed, and the family followed without question, because in this household, obedience mattered more than comfort. Home was not built with walls or neighbors, but assigned, temporary, and always subject to change. New schools arrived without warning, and just as quickly, they disappeared again. New towns blurred together, each one offering unfamiliar hallways, unfamiliar faces, and the same silent countdown until the next move. Over and over again, John learned how to arrive and leave without ceremony. That constant motion carved something into him quietly, something that did not fade with age. He developed a sense of displacement, not loud or dramatic, but steady and heavy, like carrying a weight no one else could see. Even when surrounded by people, he felt separate, as if he belonged nowhere completely. He was often the new kid, the one teachers watched closely and classmates didn't fully understand. Misunderstanding followed him easily, because he struggled to explain himself and rarely felt heard. Loneliness became familiar, not as a crisis, but as a condition he learned to live with. School offered little refuge, as academics never came easily to him and only deepened his sense of being out of step. Emotionally, he felt disconnected from the rhythm of the world around him, as if everyone else knew the rules he had somehow missed. Yet in the middle of that confusion, he stumbled upon something steady enough to hold on to. Music entered his life not as ambition but as relief. The acoustic guitar became his anchor, 6 strings that stayed the same no matter where he was sent next. When everything else shifted, the sound in his hands remained familiar and dependable. Outside the noise of classrooms and expectations, he found another quiet refuge in nature. Wide skies, open land, and long stretches of silence offered him something people could not: consistency without judgment. Mountains did not move, rivers did not leave, and in their stillness, he felt a kind of belonging that had always escaped him. Long before the world knew the name John Denver, these early years were already shaping the man he would become. The themes that later defined his music were being written into him slowly, through distance, longing, and repeated goodbyes. Home was never something he had, only something he kept searching for. In the early 1960s, folk music was more than a sound drifting through coffeehouses and small stages. It was a movement built on honesty, stripped-down truth, and stories that sounded like real lives being lived. It rejected excess and demanded sincerity, and for John, who had spent his childhood feeling unseen and unsettled, that world felt familiar in a way nothing else ever had. He stepped into it quietly, not chasing attention, but searching for a place where vulnerability was allowed. In 1965, he joined the Mitchell Trio, standing on stage as one voice among others, blending harmonies and learning the discipline of performance. Night after night, he watched audiences respond not to loud gestures or spectacle, but to simple words sung with conviction. Yet even as the group gained attention, a quiet tension followed him, because something inside him remained unfinished. He wasn't meant to disappear into a group or be remembered as part of a collective sound. The songs forming inside him were personal, shaped by longing, distance, and the constant movement that defined his youth. They felt less like compositions and more like journal entries set to melody. So he made a choice that carried risk and uncertainty. He left the trio and stepped into a period that breaks many artists before they ever find their footing. This was the waiting period, where rejection arrives more often than opportunity and belief is tested daily. There was no instant fame waiting on the other side, no overnight success story to soften the doubt. John survived by writing songs for others, quietly sending pieces of himself into the world through voices that were not his own. One of those songs was a gentle farewell about distance, love, and the ache of leaving. Leaving on a jet plane captured something universal, even if John himself was still largely unknown. In 1969, Peter, Paul and Mary took that song to #1, and suddenly, the industry took notice of the man behind the words. But before fame could define him, John made another decision that would shape everything that followed. He changed his name, choosing John Denver, not because it marked his birthplace, but because it represented the home he never had. Colorado, with its mountains and open skies, gave him an identity rooted in permanence, and he carried that name forward like a promise to himself that one day, he would belong somewhere at last. The 1970s did not arrive quietly for John Denver. They arrived with open arms and an audience ready to listen. After years of waiting and writing from the margins, the decade finally aligned with his voice, his values, and his need to be heard. This was not a slow rise anymore, it was recognition on a global scale. In 1971, a song about winding roads, memory, and emotional return reached people across borders and generations. Take Me Home, Country Roads was not aggressive or demanding, and it carried no challenge to authority or culture. It simply spoke the truth of missing something deeply, and millions felt seen inside it. The song spread because it sounded real. It did not shout, it did not posture, and it did not pretend to be anything other than honest. In a world growing louder, its quiet certainty became its power. What followed was not a single hit, but a steady stream of songs that carried the same emotional center. Rocky Mountain High reflected awe without arrogance, while Sunshine on My Shoulders offered warmth without apology. Annie's song, Thank God I'm a Country Boy, Back Home Again, and Calypso all echoed the same heartbeat, gratitude for life and clarity of feeling. While other artists of the era leaned into excess, rebellion, and spectacle, John Denver stayed grounded in belonging. His music did not ask listeners to escape reality, it asked them to appreciate it. That consistency made him stand out even more in a decade defined by extremes. At his peak, the numbers told a story few could match. Over 300 million records sold worldwide, multiple Grammy wins and nominations, television specials watched by tens of millions, and appearances across film and television cemented his reach. He was no longer just successful, he was everywhere. Yet even as his voice became one of the most recognizable on earth, something about fame never fully settled on him. Applause did not replace the calm he found in open spaces, and attention never gave him what silence did. No matter how high his career climbed, it was clear that success fit him far less comfortably than the mountains he sang about. John Denver never fit neatly into the boxes the music industry depended on to function. His sound moved freely between folk storytelling, country warmth, and pop accessibility, not because he was experimenting, but because that blend reflected who he was at his core. To him, music was not a category to defend, it was a language meant to be understood. This refusal to stay in one lane unsettled critics who preferred clearer definitions. His songs carried a gentle optimism that felt out of step with an era increasingly drawn to excess, edge, and confrontation. Some dismissed him as too wholesome, too soft, or too earnest, as though emotional sincerity were something to be embarrassed by rather than respected. The criticism was not subtle, and it followed him even as his success continued to grow. There was a belief among certain industry voices that his music lacked the grit required to be taken seriously. What they overlooked was that his gentleness was not weakness, but intention. That tension became impossible to ignore in 1975 when John Denver was chosen to host the Country Music Association Awards. For many viewers, it seemed like a natural decision, given his popularity and connection to country audiences. But behind the scenes and in public reactions, backlash erupted almost immediately. Traditionalists questioned his presence, arguing that he was not real country, and did not belong on that stage. The criticism had little to do with his talent or his reach and everything to do with control over what country music was allowed to represent. John Denver had crossed boundaries without asking permission, and that made him an uncomfortable figure. Yet the irony of the moment was impossible to miss. While critics debated definitions, his songs were already becoming permanent fixtures in American culture. They played at gatherings, on long drives, and in quiet moments of reflection, connecting with people who did not care what genre label was attached. Over time, those same songs outlived most of the arguments surrounding them. They became cultural landmarks, not because they followed rules, but because they spoke to something universal. They endured because they felt honest, not because they met expectations. John Denver was never chasing credibility from industry institutions or approval from purists. He was chasing truth, the kind that came from lived experience and emotional clarity. That truth resonated far beyond genre lines, reaching listeners who recognized themselves in his songs, even when the industry struggled to recognize him. Behind the calm voice and reassuring smile was a man far more complicated than his music ever suggested. John Denver believed deeply that artists carried responsibility, not just to entertain audiences, but to leave the world better than they found it. Fame, to him, was not a reward, it was a tool, and he intended to use it. As his influence grew, so did his commitment to causes larger than himself. He became a lifelong environmental activist, speaking openly about conservation, clean energy, and humanity's fragile relationship with the planet. This was not performative concern, but sustained action rooted in belief. John founded the WinStar Foundation as a place for education and sustainable thinking. He testified before the United States Congress, lending his voice to environmental policy discussions at a time when few entertainers dared to step into that space. His work extended internationally through cooperation with the United Nations, where he supported peace initiatives, hunger relief, scientific progress, and global responsibility. To the public, this activism reinforced the image of a gentle man guided by principle. To those close to him, however, they knew the private reality was more complicated. The same intensity that fueled his convictions also surfaced in his personal life. His marriage to Annie Martel produced one of his most beloved songs, Annie's Song, a piece that captured tenderness and devotion in its purest form. Yet love in music did not guarantee harmony in life, and their marriage ended in divorce after years of strain. The separation marked a painful contradiction between the love he could express in song and the difficulty he faced sustaining it day to day. His second marriage, to Cassandra Delaney, followed a similar path. Hope returned briefly, but unresolved patterns resurfaced, and that relationship also ended. The repeated failures weighed on him, forcing a reckoning he could no longer avoid. In later years, John spoke openly about his struggles. He acknowledged his anger, emotional volatility, and the conflicts that followed him into close relationships. Rather than hide behind his public image, he admitted that the man behind the smile was still learning how to live with himself. Through all of this, one passion remained constant. Flying was not a hobby to John Denver, it was a refuge. In the air, he found the same freedom he felt in music, a space where expectations fell away and the world below grew quiet. Aviation connected him to his father's world and fulfilled something deeply personal. When he flew, gravity loosened its grip, and the restlessness that followed him since childhood seemed to fade. In the sky, John Denver felt unbound, suspended between who he was and who he hoped to be. On October 12, 1997, John Denver took off alone in an experimental aircraft over Monterey Bay, expecting nothing more than another quiet flight above the water. Flying had always been familiar to him, almost sacred, a place where the noise of fame and expectation could not reach. That afternoon, the sky did not offer him the escape it always had. Not long after takeoff, something went wrong. The aircraft lost control while John attempted to switch fuel tanks, a maneuver that required precision at exactly the wrong moment. There was no time to recover, no second chance to correct the mistake, and the flight ended before anyone could intervene. Investigators later examined every detail with care and restraint. They found no drugs in his system, no alcohol, and no evidence that recklessness or poor judgment played a role. The conclusion was simple and devastating: the crash was ruled an accident. For a man whose life had been shaped by movement, freedom, and the open sky, the irony was impossible to ignore. Flight had always symbolized peace and release for him, a space where gravity loosened and worries faded. In the end, it became the place where his journey stopped. The world reacted not with shock-driven spectacle, but with quiet mourning. Fans turned inward, replaying songs that had once carried them through loneliness, joy, and reflection. His death felt personal, as though a familiar voice had suddenly gone silent. Yet John Denver did not disappear with that final flight. His music continued to live on, echoing through classrooms where children learned melodies before meanings, and through radios that filled empty rooms with warmth. His songs became companions on long drives, moments of comfort during transitions, and reminders of simpler truths. Country Roads grew beyond its origins and became a global anthem, not because it named a specific place, but because it named a feeling people everywhere recognized. It spoke to longing without bitterness and belonging without ownership. That emotional clarity gave the song a life far beyond charts or decades. John Denver's legacy rests on qualities rarely celebrated at the same time. He carried artistic sincerity without irony, moral conviction without performance, and emotional openness without apology. In an industry that often rewarded noise and excess, he chose gentleness and stood by it. His life showed that power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through honest words and steady belief, and stays long after the voice that carried it is gone. John Denver proved that kindness could endure, and that a gentle presence could leave the deepest mark of all. John Denver didn't just sing about home. He helped millions feel like they belonged. If this story moved you, if his music ever carried you through a quiet moment, like this video, share it, and subscribe for more cinematic stories that honor voices worth remembering. Because some songs don't fade, they become part of us.